For better or worse, instantaneous global communication has become a staple of modern living. Thanks to the internet, humanity is more connected than ever before, allowing for the spread of ideas and information of all kinds on a scale scarcely imaginable, even to those of us who use the technology each day. When you stop and think about it, the internet is really quite the remarkable concept, being so vast and incomprehensible as to inspire its own subset of philosophical reverence, which, in many ways, has come to serve as a fundamental musing in science fiction. It ought to come as no surprise that the wonders of the net, and what, in the past, it stood to become, have inspired creative minds for generations, and indeed, that influence is expressed in an especially imaginative way within Mike Pondsmith's cyberpunk universe in particular. The net of the dark future, while similar to our own, has come about in a very different way, morphing throughout the ages from a promising frontier of exploration and expression to a wasteland filled with the refuse of a bygone age. It's a vast system that manages to be both ahead of and behind its real-world analog, existing in a realm of the intangible, but managing to be a very real threat nevertheless. As of Cyberpunk 2077, the net is all but completely different from anything that's come before, with new players who aren't familiar with the older source material potentially being unaware of the area's massive scope in the past. That's why today, we'll be taking a look into the complete history of the net from the world of Cyberpunk, examining its most pivotal explorers, its shadowy corners, and getting a feel for how this massive information complex has changed with time. This is a look into the full history and transformation of Cyberpunk's interactive information superhighway, a world of data known only as the net. The origins of Cyberpunk's net and its history are effectively indistinguishable from our own prototypical internet infrastructure prior to the mid-1990s. Whether or not the net in canon is meant to have been completely analogous to ours at the same time is more or less inconsequential, but it's clear that they were at least very similar, given that the first edition of the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game was released in 1988, a time when computers would have looked like this. The one thing that's important to understand right away is that although many people, myself included, often like to think of or refer to Cyberpunk's net as an equivalent to our internet, and while this comparison is quite apt in a lot of ways, it isn't completely genuine either. It would be more correct to say that the net is something of an at-scale version of a more archaic form of global communications protocol, such as ARPANET. Envisioning a globalized network in this way was exceptionally common within cyberpunk literature of the 1980s and 90s, and it's something that we're going to see evolve throughout this timeline, especially as the net has continued to develop in the real world, so just keep that in mind for now. The first substantial discrepancies between the net of the real world and that of Cyberpunk came in 1996, with the collapse, a devastating stock market crash that would have led to massive economic recession in the United States. This is often looked at as a major turning point between the dark future and our own world, the colloquial butterfly whose beating wings would go on to produce the disparate reality that Cyberpunk represents, and which would, in the process, signify the beginning of the end for the old US, as the federal government lost control of many of the states. Though it may serve as the figurative separation point between the story of our net and that of Cyberpunk, any ramifications that the crash would have on telecommunications would be relatively temporary, as was alluded to in our first and most prominent source in today's topic, Raish Bartmoss's Guide to the Net, a Cyberpunk 2020 sourcebook that presents itself as the writings of the late great Raish Bartmoss, an exceptionally influential netrunner who we'll talk about quite a lot as this video goes on. As he described, quote, "The development of the net was delayed by the crash, but it achieved the pinnacle of its first generation when WorldSat completed its global satellite system in 2001. The net, though still infant, had grown to encompass the globe, and freewheeling netrunners were starting to appear everywhere. Indeed, while some form of globalized network was achieved rather quickly, around the same time as our own in fact, don't let the use of the word netrunner fool you here. The technology to become fully immersed in the net the way we would expect of a traditional netrunner would not exist at this point in time, though the world wouldn't have to wait too long. It was only 4 years later, when the cyber modem was released in 2005, that human interaction with the net would change forever. This innovation from the Kenjiri Technologies firm made it possible to render data in 3 dimensions, integrating directly with a user's mind to create a sense of literal cyberspace. This was, as one can imagine, a significant advancement, allowing for the net to be accessed in a much more immersive and impactful way. It was also now that the term netrunner would come to be used more to encompass those who interacted with the net through means of a cyber modem rather than your everyday user. Though a proper internet was still a concept alien to the cyberpunk world at the time, the planet was rapidly becoming more interconnected, and at the helm of all that progress, there was one group beginning to take shape. A collective with so much influence over the net that they would become synonymous with its very existence. And the name of that group was Internet. No, hold on, that's not right. One more time? Okay, yeah, they were called Internet. Confusingly, and extremely coincidentally in retrospect, the word Internet in terms of the Cyberpunk series was not the concept of some globalized network in and of itself, so to speak, but rather it was a corporation, or more accurately, a cabal of corporations. The hypertext of Ray Bartmoss's Guide to the Net describes them as, quote, a consortium of phone companies that, while technically independent of each other, almost always work within the monolithic facade of Internet. This effectively makes Internet the single largest conglomerate in the world, if highly decentralized. An oddly prophetic characterization for certain, but one that's made all the more interesting with Raish's own limited input. Quote, I ain't gonna talk about Internet, just do as they say. They don't own the net, they are the net. Add that to the list of things that Mike Pondsmith magically foresaw within this series. Regardless, in and shortly after 2005, the once proprietary technology of the cyber modem would begin to work its way into the hands of other corporations, aside from Kenjiri Technologies, resulting in a back and forth that only caused more prevalence and models of cyber modems on the market moving into the latter half of the decade. Quote, within a few years, cyber modems were being improved by leaps and bounds, and interface programs were appearing on every bulletin board across the country. The net had come into its own, past the mewling infancy stage, and into a recognizable existence. Just like how the early internet of our world was defined largely by creative expression and an eclectic, non-linear mashup of different sites or stylings, cyber modems of the time allowed for users to experience the net in a variety of different ways, depending on the interface program that they had installed. Whether you wanted to explore cyberspace in the style of fantasy, film noir, or a generic electronic image, the way one perceived data, and by proxy the overall experience of the net itself, was dictated entirely by these programs. At the time, the net was abuzz with different interpretations, all serving whatever themes and facades the runner could fancy. But much like our real internet, this era of unique expression would inevitably be replaced by one of streamlined virtual perception. It all started in 2009, when Internet, the company, remember, enticed one Nobuhiko Ihara, an at the time Zetatech employee, as well as Janice A. Grubb, one of the people responsible for the creation of the cyber modem, to collaboratively engineer a piece of software that would forever reshape the net, recreating the ley lines of cyberspace from the ground up, this time with a singular look and feel. The Ihara-Grubb transformation algorithms, as they were called, took around 5 years to complete, and in September of 2014 they would hit the net with only around 24 hours of notice given beforehand. Once released, it took 10 hours for every piece of data to be fully re-rendered, and afterwards, life more or less would go on as usual, albeit without some of the fun and whimsy of independently styled information. From here, 6 years would elapse, and by 2020 we get the most extensive look into the world of cyberspace yet. Cyber modems may have become a bit smaller, recorded as, quote, about the size of a paperback book by this time, but the larger advancements came in the form of fully portable cyberdecks, and even those that could be implanted directly into a cyber limb. It was now possible to explore the virtual world in more places than ever before, which was good, because the net was also becoming far more exploration-worthy. While the Ihara-Grubb transformation algorithms primarily aimed to create a uniform net experience, it also managed to introduce a few new features to runners in the process. One of these introductions was the icon system, allowing for you, the netrunner, to craft a perception of yourself through your cyberdeck that could be displayed in net space for all to see. Not only this, but one also would have some capacity of of influence over data and cyberspace objects that they would generate. It was likely through this sort of data sculpting process that the visual identities of net regions would come to be formed. Fundamentally, net regions were, well, regions of the net. Data streams from similar areas of the world would manifest relative to one another in cyberspace, causing a believable analog of real space to emerge, effectively creating a massive world map defined entirely by data signatures. Make no mistake though, net regions were not at all some nebulous concept used to describe vaguely specific areas. They were very much constrained, sequestered areas of the virtual world, defined by mostly hard and fast borders, with a dominant power of each informing the look and feel of the data that encompassed them. I'm going to take some time now to go over each and every net region of 2020 in some cursory detail, so that you, the viewer, has a decent conception of what each was like. But truth be told, I'll only be scratching the very surface of each region within this video, so that we're not focusing entirely on them. I'll bet there's enough content to talk for several hours about cyberspace in the year 2020 in particular, but that's not the goal right now, so I'm going to give you a much more abridged version in order to pace this video a little bit more accessibly. That being said, I'm definitely open to revisiting the net regions of 2020 at a later date, and examining them in a bit more granular detail, because there really are a lot of creative ideas and portrayals of cyberspace here that I do want to talk about. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in seeing, because I think it could definitely be quite a lot of fun, while also being especially informative for all of the tabletop game masters out there, of which I know there's a decent handful that watch these videos. Either way though, here's the regions of the net at a glance. The net region known as Pacifica was one of the largest. It encompassed a vast amount of the Pacific Ocean, hence its name, and in spite of the large area that it covered, was one of the emptier regions owing to all that water. As a result, the most heavily trafficked areas of the zone occurred around the edges, in places like the North American West Coast and the continent of Australia. Visually, the zone played very much into the ocean theme, hosting picturesque digital waters filled with fish and AI in the form of dolphins. Proceeding eastward from Pacifica, runners would find Olympia, sometimes described as the neutral zone of the net, encompassing a number of the free states at the time, such as Wyoming and the Republic of Texas. The largest clusters of data here were centered around Midwestern cities, each of which fashioned their virtual infrastructure in a pretty unique way. Renditions of skyscrapers and buildings were said to hang in the air, with both the top and bottom-facing portions mirroring one another in a kaleidoscopic sort of fashion, making the region an elegant but disorienting place to be. Then we have the Rust Belt, which covers the entire United States East Coast and most of Canada. In stark contrast to the relative freedom offered by Olympia, the Rust Belt was an area lorded over by US government forces and by Netwatch, a global organization dedicated to policing cyberspace. They were present everywhere, but especially here. Seemingly styled after the very concept of industrialization, the Rust Belt as a whole was inarguably unnatural in its presentation, which for many only served to deepen the oppressive atmosphere. The Atlantis region was another ocean-encompassing zone, sharing similarities to Pacifica, though its main claim to fame was the notoriously unreliable infrastructure that the region was hosted on. It would frequently go out of service and cause the Atlantis borders to change regularly. As for the visuals, well, I think Bart Moss offers a better summary than I could. Quote, "Atlantis's virtual environment is the most old-fashioned, largely similar to the old Tronic interfaces of the last decade. It's supposed to look cool and hip and high-tech, but mostly it feels claustrophobic and desperately stylized." Africani was the name of the region covering Africa, and relative to the rest of the world, it's said that the area was hosted on antiquated equipment, with a regional style of equally dated taste. The region was fashioned after the continent's savannas, programs manifested in the form of animals, and many runners adopted icons of tribal masks, with much of the landscape permeated in a digital mist. Don't let the surface-level motifs fool you though. Africani was directly backed by orbital air, and for a while could have been set to become a power player on the world stage. To the north of Africani is the Euro Theater, home of Netwatch and, resultantly, one of the more heavily observed regions right up there with the Rust Belt. It covers the European continent, and is dominated with digitized marble and stonework that brings to mind the Greek and Roman empires of old, as well as a selection of Renaissance-era recreations. Perhaps it should come as as no surprise that the Eurotheater saw itself as, quote, the most civilized region of the net. Whether this sense of self-importance rose from their data creations or an intense sense of order, I couldn't tell you. The eastern border of the Eurotheater was shared with an area aptly called Sov space, controlled by the Soviet Union, which swallowed the majority of the Asian continent. Quote, the Sov space virtual is made of a combination of future shock claustrophobia and reminiscences for lost days of glory and global power, bolstered by paranoia, subrate systems, and a harsh survivalist pragmatism. The system construct appears as European burges, old-fashioned with narrow, winding, cobbled streets and data forts crammed together tighter than apartments in San Francisco. Entire city grids are so jam-packed that the uninitiated American runner can try to run to the edge of a city grid and suddenly find himself in the next country. Nothing is clear, nothing is straight, and the line of sight is desperately short. The Tokyo/Shiba region was a small yet dense portion of the net that served Japan and some of the East Asian mainland. It incorporated traditional East Asian imagery into its design and was influenced immensely by forces like Arasaka and the Far Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, even more than it was influenced by Netwatch. Tokyo-Shiba probably was regarded as a beautiful area of cyberspace to many, if you could ignore the oppressive grip held by the various Zaibatsu, that is. And finally, that brings us to Orbitsville, the last official region composed of satellites and orbital infrastructure that extended far beyond the limits of Earthbound systems. Orbitsville was far, far more vast than any terrestrial region, and with runners able to travel so far from their corporeal bodies in this zone, it's perhaps no surprise that there was some amount of signal lag experienced pretty much everywhere when visiting. From what I can tell, a visual style is never defined for Orbitsville, though one might imagine that it could vary somewhat depending on who owned the satellites you were interfacing with. For all of the areas that weren't mentioned here, such as India, the South Pole, and mainland China, these were considered wilder space, a catch-all term to describe unmapped networks and systems that didn't fit into the overall fold. So yeah, as you can see, the state of the net in 2020 was pretty robust, all things considered. And once again, that's really not even scratching the surface of each of the net regions and what made them unique. In many ways, this really was the golden age of net running, being able to experience an interconnected realm of systems, one which readily extended far beyond the atmosphere of even Earth itself. It's probably the closest that the dark future has ever come to having its own version of a truly interconnected internet analog. But alas, all good things must come to an end. The year was 2022, and the Fourth Corporate War was just getting underway. An infamous conflict between oceanographic megacorps Sino and OTEC, as well as their hired defense firms, Arasaka and Militech respectively. Net sabotage and warfare was a pivotal angle of this conflict, at least in the early days. As a result, many top netrunners were recruited on both sides, including Raish Bartmoss, who was convinced by the digitized consciousness of his late friend Alt Cunningham, herself a netrunner of considerable renown, to aid OTEC and Militech against Arasaka forces early in the war. This would put Bartmoss directly in the crosshair of the Zaibatsu, who eventually executed him either by way of a covert strike team or orbital strike, all while he was jacked into the net. If you're curious over the specifics of how all of this came about and wish to explore this period of time in a bit more detail, then I have an entire video about the life and legacy of Bartmoss linked in the top right. But in terms of this video, it's what happened as a result of Bartmoss's passing that most concerns us. Shortly before Arasaka forces put an end to the legendary runner, Spider Murphy, who was present with Bartmoss in the net during his final moments, would witness him manipulate a mysterious data object, the purpose of which would remain a mystery for some time. A mystery that would unceremoniously offer its own resolution just over 2 weeks later. It's thought that what Bartmoss was actually doing in those final moments with Murphy was setting in place a sort of countdown, one which would set into motion the single most catastrophic event ever to reach cyberspace. After these 2 weeks were up, the net would be overtaken by software the likes of which had never been seen publicly before. They were called Rabbids, and they were artificial intelligences that Bartmoss himself had sewn into the very fabric of net reality during the Ihara-Grubb transformations of 2014. At the time, they were some of the most advanced and dangerous systems ever made. As the Rabbids emerged from the fabric of cyberspace, they would kill any netrunners that they'd come across while quickly moving from system to system and net region to net region, leaving only obfuscated and corrupted data in their wake. One may imagine the DataKrash as an event of biblical proportions for the net, a wave of madness that spread throughout cyberspace and which proved very difficult to contain by the powers that be. In this time, unfathomable amounts of data would be destroyed and countless runners lost their lives, not only because of the Rabbids themselves, but also the new, corrupted, and warped AI which would emerge through chance in the midst of the chaos. That's not to say that all usable data was destroyed though. According to in-universe estimates, it's thought that approximately 78.2% of net-connected data was infected by the Rabbids, but this still left around 1 in every 5 systems adrift and untouched in the sea of pandemonium. As it happened, the digitized consciousness of Cunningham, who I mentioned earlier, was one such surviving system, and she wasn't alone either. Over time, various uncorrupted AI would make their way out of the woodwork, but in its current state, the net at large wasn't exactly safe for them either, and so it wasn't long before Alt and some of these other AIs would look for a quiet, abandoned corner of cyberspace to call their own. In and around 2020, it had been rumored that Alt had established a location in Wilderspace known as Shangri-La, a virtual ghost town which had served as home for many human AIs who had once been victims of Soulkiller. But now, it said that even more of these towns had begun to crop up in other places in the net, including in Hong Kong, where a potent bioplague had killed or displaced all human life in the area, thus offering a number of vacant and automatically upkept servers to house even large, transcendental beings. It was in these ghost towns that many systems would patiently reside while those in the physical world sought a solution to prevent the further spread of the Rabbids. It wouldn't be until the early 2030s when someone was finally prepared to address the issues posed by the DataKrash head-on, and restore humanity's ability to run the net, albeit in a more limited capacity. It was the communication infrastructure company Ziggurat that would first prove successful in this regard with the creation of Citinets. These were air-gapped local networks made to serve a city and those who presided in it while retaining separation from the rest of the net except through very heavily monitored and secured means. Although limited in scope, this would at least allow for everyday people to have access to information again, primarily through the system of data terminals available for public access across the cities in question. Before long, Citinets had been established in various areas across the United States, but it's hard to deny that the scope of the net had become far more limited after the crash, even with this small win in terms of advancement. Something much bigger was going to have to transpire before any real semblance of normalcy could be achieved again. But luckily, there was another group dedicated to something of a more permanent solution. Netwatch was on the case. At the time that it was first being devised, their secret project would have been kept very heavily under wraps, but thanks to the Cyberpunk Red corebook, we know that it was in full swing by at least 2045. Quote, "For the past 22 years, Netwatch has been a police force without a beat. Their main job has been to act as lifeguards, finding renegade runners who've managed to find a back door into the now off-limits old net and are being torn to ribbons by the bad stuff that now inhabits the dungeon, as Netwatch pros and runners now call the old net architecture. They bail the Weeful runners out, and then run for cover before the really awful black ice descends upon them like the hammer of Thor. But recently, with the help of Cunningham and a mysterious cabal of transcendental AIs, Netwatch head, Magnificent Curtis, and his crack team have been able to write software that could tackle the black ice and Rabbids that have infested the old net, and behind the scenes, the Transcendentals, the Ghosts, and Netwatch have been working together on a project to get the net under control, a project that exists on no books or official documents, known only by the ominous title of the Blackwall. It took an undisclosed amount of time for the Blackwall to be completed, but when it was, its implementation came about quite suddenly, as the database entry for the infrastructure in Cyberpunk 2077 states, quote, "The Blackwall came without warning, out of nowhere, which meant that any runners left stranded on the other side had no way to safely jack out, nor survive indefinitely in cyberspace. As a result, Netwatch managed to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, neutralizing the threat of AIs and getting rid of troublesome hackers. The price of the Blackwall meant abandoning major technological advancements that came with self-aware AIs. Nevertheless, Netwatch made up for it by creating new tools that would grant them even greater access over the net. Nowadays, Netwatch exercises almost exclusive control over the usable portions of cyberspace, and the Blackwall still stands, although not as imposingly as it once had.
Any idea how many attacks from behind the Blackwall we neutralized last year?
Want me to guess?
So you don't know. No one in Night City knows, outside of us. And no one wants to know. People imagine it as a great border wall, a one-time solution to protect humanity forever. Whereas, it's more like a torn-open trash bag taped over a busted window.
Although Netwatch has managed to maintain public perception regarding its might and integrity, the truth is that the Blackwall has proven far from singularly effective or impregnable. The frightening reality is that more than a few people have managed to breach the Blackwall in recent times, with those people serving all manner of different groups of interest. Lucy Kushinada from Cyberpunk Edgerunners, for example, explored the old net under the duress of the Arasaka Corporation. More recently, in 2077, Song So-mi was shown to have repeatedly breached the Blackwall for the personal interests of Rosalind Myers. And even some gangs, like the Voodoo Boys, are insinuated to do so at regular intervals. Even V, the protagonist of the Cyberpunk 2077 game, ventures to the far side of the wall to make contact with Alt Cunningham, an event which directly heralds in the end of the game's storyline, in whatever form that may take. Given everything we know and have learned, it seems that although the future of the net may manifest in a number of different ways, there's one thing that seems just about inevitable, and that's the full-blown breach of the Blackwall at some point in the near future. We've already explored a couple of ways in which people have proven capable of subverting the barrier entirely, but perhaps the scarier thought is that we also know of some AI that have done the same thing. Delamain and Alt Cunningham are just 2 examples of old net hailing systems that have recently worked their way into Night City NetSpace, and it's doubtful that they're the only ones. All of this raises a lot of questions, and points to some pretty frightening implications indeed regarding if and when humanity will once again have to face their creations, with many speculating that such a conflict may even serve as the main plot point of the upcoming sequel to Cyberpunk 2077, codenamed Cyberpunk Orion. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have my own speculations as well, but maybe those are best left for another video. For now, I guess all we can do is watch and wait for the veil to fall, for the Blackwall to crumble, and for the old net to come rushing back with renewed vigor. And with that, you've reached the end of this video. Thank you for watching today, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the past, present, and future of Cyberpunk's net. If you thought this was cool and haven't done so already, then maybe consider subscribing to get notified of future lore-related uploads. And if you've got anything to say about this video, whether it be something you've liked, didn't like, or your own theories and thoughts, then definitely let me know in the comments. I try and read each and every one, and I always appreciate the insightful stuff that you guys are giving me to think about. Also, seriously let me know if you'd be interested in seeing a video specifically dedicated to 2020's net regions. I really would be interested in making something like that, and I think it could be pretty cool. Anyway, that pretty much does it for me. As always, thanks again for watching. This is Averberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.